Hello, thanks for joining the 5-minute Bible study today in the book of Colossians. We continue in chapter 2, and today we're in verse 17. As always, we want to make sure we get the full context, so go ahead and read in your Bibles from verses 16 through the end of chapter 2, and you'll get an idea of fully what Paul's trying to say here. Today in verse 17, we read this: Things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. So we can see that's just a clause in the middle of a thought. And so as we recognize what Paul's talking about, we need to go back into verse 16 and see these things that Paul's talking about here in verse 17. What are those things? It's what are you eating? What are you drinking? What are you celebrating? What are the holidays? And we see that there are things in both the pagan and the Jewish laws that would say how you were supposed to be a good citizen, how you're supposed to be a good religious person, how you're supposed to be spiritual. Eat these things, don't drink these things, celebrate these holidays. In the Jewish faith, in many ways, especially in this time, in the time of Paul and the time of Jesus, these rules and regulations became so important that it became the religion. It became what everything was about. You see, the Pharisees were constantly following the letter of the law. Jesus has to preach this entire Sermon on the Mount to explain that though your teachers are teaching you these things, I tell you that it's not about the letter of the law, it's about the spirit of the law. And so when we recognize what the Jewish and the pagan people thought about religion, we realize that it was about following these laws and doing these things. And while many of them are good, Paul's saying these are just a shadow. He says specifically things which are a mere shadow, but the substance belongs to Christ. He uses this idea of shadow and substance, and this is not something new for Paul. In fact, this is something that Plato had started way back hundreds of years before these letters were ever written. So Paul's borrowing from Plato this idea of shadow and substance. And in the Hellenistic idea, in the Greek mind, the idea was there are some things that appear this way, shadow, but they're really this way, substance. And that's somewhat what Paul's point is here. He's trying to say that there is something here. There's a shadow. A shadow is real. It's not something imaginary. It is something real. It's something there. However, the shadow is, number one, dependent on something else. Without that something else, there is no shadow. You put a man in the middle of the field, you'll see his shadow, but you take the man away and that shadow no longer is there. So the shadow is dependent on something else, and that something else is the substance. That something else is what it's really about. While the shadow gives us a vague idea of what the substance is, it's not detailed, it's not full, it's not complete. But when we look at the substance, it is the thing. It's what it's all about. So if you're concentrating on the shadow, you've missed the substance. And that's Paul's point here. Paul's point is we're not worried about the shadow, the what you eat and what you drink and what you're celebrating. We're worried about the substance, which is Christ, which is Jesus. Jesus fulfills the shadow. Why were all these laws created in the Jewish faith? They pointed to a future time. They pointed to a future time which existed now in Paul's time, the coming of Messiah. So now that Messiah is here, we don't need to worry about all these other things. And that's why in other places Paul says that it doesn't matter what you eat or what you drink, because Christ is the one who has provided it all for us, and everything that God gives us is good. And so what we recognize here is Paul saying, you don't need to add these legalistic things that the false teachers are telling you. You have to eat these things, you have to drink these things, you have to celebrate these holidays. Instead, we need to put our focus on what the important thing is: Christ. He's the substance. He's what this is all about. The last little piece here is in between all that, it speaks about what is to come. And as we look at the festivals and we look at the Jewish laws, they're always pointing to the future. What we recognize today is that Jesus has fulfilled many of those things, but we also recognize there's coming a time where he will finish fulfilling all these things. And so we as Christians sit in this time in between where we're looking forward to the day that Jesus comes again to fulfill all those prophecies and all those shadows, because he is the substance. So with that, thank you so much for joining me today for our 5-minute Bible study. That concludes verse 17. Tomorrow we'll go into verse 18. I look forward to seeing you then. Until then, if you have any thoughts, any questions, any comments, go ahead and put them in the comments section below. And I'd be more than happy to speak to you about those things. Until then, have a wonderful day, and God bless you.